Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. One more time, good morning to you. We just kicked off the Joint Warfighter Conference 2011. The Deputy Commander of U.S. Cybercom, Lieutenant General Rooster Schmidl. Very, very important kickoff to this conference as cyber affects everybody. When you take a look at it, we have an action-packed 3 days, action-packed and probably one of the most powerful agendas and programs that we've had in the last 4 years. Every one of the major commands, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard, and ACT, every one represented here at the most senior level. I'd like to offer a special welcome this morning to General Bob Cohn, the brand new commander of the Training and Doctrine Command of the United States Army, a great warrior and a great friend. General Cohn, glad to have you with us, sir. Looking ahead, what's working that we can use in full spectrum operations? Very powerful title, very relevant today, and more importantly than relevant today, relevant into the future. Whether you are a futures kind of person or you're building the bench for the future, this is a very, very important topic. I know that Major General Bob Scales is shown in the program to be the moderator for this conference. And I would tell you, since we're in baseball season, I would tell you that Bob is on injured reserve right now and progressing well. And I know he wanted to be here. We've talked. But I will tell you that if you were to talk about a pinch hitter, a designated hitter, Lieutenant General retired Bob Wood, former Deputy Commander, Joint Forces Command, he may be the pinch hitter, but there is no doubt in anybody's mind, but he himself is a starter. He himself is a starter. He himself is a warrior. Yes, he's a field artilleryman, near and dear to my heart, but the fact of the matter is, he's a soldier's soldier, and he understands from the very entry-level soldiers to the commander-in-chief, having worked also the White House fellow, what this is all about. He gets it, commanded in war and peace, from the AOR to Korea. We are honored to have him and the distinguished panel speaking to us today, and I'm going to let Bob Wood introduce his panel. Ladies and gentlemen, Lieutenant General Bob Wood.
I did indeed get a call to step up and replace Bob and Scales, and all wishes and prayers to him for his good health. An opportunity to come back to Norfolk to the Joint Warfighting Conference, and I remember 3 years ago when we kicked this off. It has grown and grown well as our fight has progressed and our fights continue. Joined today by a great panel, which I'll introduce in a minute. Coming back to Tidewater, it's also probably an opportunity to give a great shout out to some wonderful joint warriors who had a pretty good week a little bit ago, and God bless them. And it changed things a little around here, not a lot. I was telling the panel here, I went out, came in late last night and went out to Virginia Beach, get a drink, and noticed there's a new drink on the block. It's called Osama bin Laden. It's 2 shots and a splash of water. It's I don't quite understand the recipe, but it was okay. And God bless our troops. God bless them. Well, we've got some great troops with us today who are here to talk about, from their perspectives, how do we leverage the successes of joint and coalition warfare. They've lived it, they've experienced it. Our experiences go back, frankly, to entry. One of our panel members from '64 to probably yesterday returned from the AOR. We have on the panel today four panelists, and I'll go through introductions and then allow them to make presentations, and questions will follow at the end. First panelist who will talk today is Lieutenant General Bob Caslen. Many of you know, CG of U.S. Army Center there at Fort Leavenworth, Combined Arms Center. Great experience, great background, and responsible for training and education. Really a generation of leaders collecting the dissemination lessons learned and really setting the path in doctrine and training and in education for a force that is really going through not only the fight we're in, but institutionalizing the lessons learned and the fights we may face in the future. Experience goes through numbers of commands in the past and will highlight, I think, the changes right in front of his new boss, some of the things that CAC is underway and undertaking, very importantly for our Army. He'll be followed next by Lieutenant General Denny Hejlik, CG of U.S. Marine Corps Forces Command, right nearby here, responsible for the deployment and readiness, the training and warfighting edge of the Marine forces who are deployed to meet the COCOM requirements worldwide. Very important command, very important responsibilities, but here's a Marine entered as E1, 1968 in the United States Marine Corps, rose to rank of Sergeant E5, in 1972 commissioned in the platoon leader course, and since has commanded at multiple levels within the Marine Corps. Most recently as CG 2MEF, but also the United States Marine Corps Special Operations Command. So he saw that transition within the Marine Corps and has key responsibilities for that. Looking forward to his comments as we look at what successes we can leverage as we look forward in this joint and coalition warfight. Next up, we've got Vice Admiral Al Krekich. He is a leader in industry and has been a leader in the United States Navy. As such, he last posting active was as the commander of surface forces in the Pacific, and then moved on to industry, where he was the president and CEO in the United States Marine Repair and then the president of BAE Systems Ship Repair. So he has seen not only war as it's fought in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, he has also seen industry as it's transformed and taken on the challenges and responsibilities to keep the warfighting edge. Looking forward to his perspectives as well. Final speaker is Bill Rue, Lieutenant General Bill Rue, right nearby from Langley, the Assistant Commander, Vice Commander, I should say, of ACC, responsible as well, like Denny, for the deploying, training, and the readiness of air power to support the combatant commanders. And very importantly, taking on responsibilities in ISR and information operations, information superiority, really looking at full spectrum from an airman's perspective. We'll see that in his remarks. I know he's very anxious to talk about the lessons, but importantly, the advantages as air power and ground forces have welded the seam or worked to weld the seam between air and ground in the irregular fight. It is a fight that we have to pay attention to. It evolves. We had this full spectrum responsibility to talk about. We spent time before coming in saying, what is full spectrum, as we saw from each service. It turns out that 3 of the 4 here were Leavenworth graduates, so it was natural for me to just reach back to a FM 3.0 and look at what an Army perspective is, and I guarantee you'll hear a broader, better, and different perspectives as we go through the panel. But just to kind of set the doctrinal edge, now this will cause a lot of glazing, but I'll read the definition for full spectrum operations. The forces combining offensive, defensive, and stability or civil support operations simultaneously as part of an interdependent joint force to seize, retain, and exploit the initiative, accepting prudent risk to create opportunities to achieve decisive results. Now that's a long statement, and really the question is, how do you do it and how is it being done? And what successes can be leveraged from that idea of full spectrum operations across the range of military operations, with all the hybrid warfare and irregular warfare and all the terminology that's mixed in between, and the new domains that we heard General Schmidl talk about of cyber. How do we really get this fight fought, and what have we learned in this fight that can help us train and educate our leaders? How do we handle the threats that are emerging across this spectrum? What changes do we have to accommodate for in COCOM priorities, as we would expect them to ask and need critical capabilities? And what skills, knowledge, and attributes are we looking for in the forces that we recruit, educate, train, and fight? Well, we have 4 experienced and different viewpoints. We'll hold our questions till the end. I'll take the prerogative of asking the first question, but I do, in fact, look forward to your responses. And so, without further ado, I'd like to have General Bob Caslen begin our panel discussion.
Thank you very much, sir. I just want to tell you it's really an honor to be here, and really privileged to be among such a distinguished panel and at this really distinguished conference. General Woods shared his joke with us, the panel members, a couple of us, right before he shared with you. You all picked it up a lot quicker than we did. It took us about a minute or so to figure it out.
Had to test fire it.
But no, this is really a fascinating topic, looking ahead what's working that we can use in full spectrum operations. And I think, at least in the Army, we're at a critical point as we draw down in Iraq and as we look to the future of Afghanistan, as we have now units that have some white space on the calendar that can be used as contingency forces for fighting a full spectrum fight. All of us in the Army are starting to look at the doctrine and the organizations that we have and how we train and develop leaders in all of this that has to do with full spectrum operations. But the title of the conference or the panel is what is really working. And as I look back and reflect over the last 10 years, the first thing I would say that is working is the development of our leaders. Leaders that have become very agile and adaptive, that can really think critically through some very complex situations that have strategic impacts both at the operational and tactical level. And these are the leaders that have learned how to build teams among the modular formations within the Army. They learn how to build teams among the joint area. They've learned how to build teams among coalition partners. And probably most difficult and challenging is they learn how to build teams among the indigenous security forces that they're partnering with, the Iraqis and the Afghans. And they've done it not only at the lieutenant and the captain level and also the sergeant level, they've done it all the way up through the ranks. And they've done a magnificent job. In order to really build teams, they had to understand the complexity of the operating environment. And this operating environment is so complex that when you look at all the drivers of instability that are out there and the natural order of hierarchy and how it has evolved over the last 10 years, it's like the threads of a sweater in that when you pull one particular thread, there's about a dozen others that are pulled out with it at the same time. Threads that have to do with tribes and historical tribes and Saddam established tribes. Threads that have to do with governance and the personalities of governance and the economy and the infrastructure of the economy and the indigenous forces, and oh, by the way, threads that have to do with the enemy as well. And to be able to understand that. When I was a brigade commander back in 2000, life as a commander was easy because all we had to do was integrate combat power at the decisive point on the battlefield in order to defeat enemy formations. But now commanders today not only have to be able to do that, but they also have to work in this building of teams and then to understand the complexity of what's going on. So they have really just really ratcheted up what command and control as we knew it was, to the point where the Army and our doctrine have catapulted our thinking to have a new definition for what commanders and their staffs do on the battlefield today, which is now called mission command. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A. One area that is very unique that we have learned as we have fought over the last 10 years is the whole effort of these small unit operations that are operating under mission command across wide areas where they have to secure wide areas. And it's in these small unit operations that we really have to look at how do you push capacity to the tactical edge where these units are. And it's in this building of capacity or pushing capacity where commanders really have to understand, capacity is in terms of intelligence, it's in terms of firepower, it's in terms of logistics and things like that. And when you have a platoon cop that's operating out there in Cop Wanat or Cop Keating, how do you push that capacity out there? And if you can't, then there's got to be a discussion among commanders of how much risk is going to be incurred as a result. And probably more important than the discussion of what risk is out there is where is the risk going to be mitigated, at what level? And if attack aviation is where risk mitigation occurs and it's at the two-star command level, the division level, then the division commander's got to be involved in that risk assessment as well. So we've learned a lot about decentralized operations and pushing capacity out to the tactical edge. As we transition to more and more full spectrum operations, and I'm glad General Woods talked about the definition of full spectrum operations that comes out of our doctrine manuals. But it's probably easiest, at least for me, to think about full spectrum operations as the offense and the defense and the stability operations, and then all of it simultaneous to some degree. And as we look at why full spectrum operations, it forces us to look at why we're going to fight full spectrum operations as we look at the threat of the future. And that threat of the future is really defined as we look at it, most likely at a hybrid sort of threat. A hybrid threat, just if you're the best way I think to look at hybrid threat is just look at Hezbollah that fought against the Israelis in Lebanon, southern Lebanon in 2006. So you had a non-state actor that was fighting, that was supported by another state that was operating in a third state, and it had not only conventional capabilities, it also had irregular warfare capabilities, criminal capabilities, and it operated in all domains to include the cyber domain. And that's what a hybrid threat is. So the full spectrum operations that we as military forces have got to be able to look at that hybrid threat and be able to deal with it. In order to help us, we're trying to work our doctrine to be able to identify what the core competencies are for ground forces to deal with full spectrum operations, or to deal in a full spectrum operations fight. And that doctrine is further going to be defined in two core competencies, one of which you call combined arms maneuver, and the second core competency of wide area security. Just think of combined arms maneuver as forces that are integrated and synchronized across the battlefield in order to defeat enemy formations and to seize key terrain, and most important, to seize and maintain the initiative. And then wide area security are those forces that retain, that after the combined arms maneuver, they go in and then they secure the area and stabilize the area and build institutions of the indigenous government, security forces, and other institutions. And that's the combined arms maneuver in wide area security. One of the things that we're finding as we start fighting these full spectrum operations fights, which is very interesting, is we're starting to exercise them in our combat training centers. And we actually had one fight recently at the Joint Readiness Training Center back last September. And it was interesting because it was with the 82nd. And the first thing they realized is when they did their airborne drop into Louisiana, they couldn't really jump in with all the cyber that they normally ripped into when they did that in Iraq and Afghanistan with all the FOBs that are already established. They had to learn how to communicate all over again on the move. But one thing that was unique about what they learned is that when they learned something, they immediately put it into their operations, which really was indicative of the adaptability of the leadership. I remember when I went through my training rotations way back before 9/11, we never had the ability to actually integrate lessons learned right into the operation. We had to take them back to home station and then integrate them into our home station training. But this is the generation that knows how to do that. In the end, it's our doctrine that's going to drive how we fight, and we got to make sure that we get our doctrine right. And then as we look at our doctrine and look at how we fight, we've got to integrate .mil-PF solutions into our organizations all the way through. I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, Danny?
Thank you very much. General Cohen, sir, congratulations and welcome aboard, and thanks for being here. And ladies and gentlemen, it really is a pleasure and honor to be here. And it was interesting as we were looking at the definition of full spectrum ops, that all four of us did the same thing. We went to JPM, Joint Pub 1, it's not in there, FMED 3, and it is in there. So I read that, and then yesterday I ran across one of my captains who had just gotten back from Afghanistan about 4 months ago and was a company commander in Southern Helmand. I said, hey, Skipper, what do you think full spectrum operations are? And he looked at me a second, not really understanding. He says, across the range of military operations, what do you think it means to you? He goes, well, sir, I think it's pretty simple. He goes, that means we do everything with today's force, and we do it today, and we do it well. And I thought about that a second, and that is really what we've evolved to over the last 10 years or so, especially at the young officer and NCO and then battalion commander, squadron level type command. When you look at full spectrum operations and you look at what we've done over the last just 5 or 6 years, full spectrum operations, I mean, you look at Operation Tomochiri in Japan, you look at Katrina, you look at earthquakes and typhoons in Haiti, and then you look at full spectrum ops or coin operations in Ambar, in Southern Helmand, Kinetic Ops, and be able to work with the IGAs, the NGAs, and Department of State, USAID. And that's what our young officers and NCOs have learned. So they understand that they have to be proficient and efficient across the full spectrum of operations. They get that. What concerns me a little bit, with the younger officers and the younger staff NCOs is the money issue. And we've all become very used to having an unlimited budget, if you will, to prosecute full spectrum operations. That's slowly going to come to at least decrease. It won't come to a halt, but it will decrease. So that's something I think that we need to be fully aware of. I think when you look at lessons learned across full spectrum ops, just like the General said, one of the biggest things for us has been the NCOs, how the NCOs have developed over the last 6 or 7 years. The NCO of today really does understand the tactical, operational, and somewhat the strategic level of war. He understands the commander's intent not 2 levels up, like I was taught, as a young company commander. He understands all the way to General Petraeus. I mean, they get that. The young corporals and sergeants that are out there working off the FOBs and COPs throughout Afghanistan, they fully understand. And they fully understand that the mistakes that they make really do have national and strategic implications. They understand that. Our young officers today, if you go into any of the TOCs or the Combat Operations Center, they have the same command suites that regiments had 6 or 7 years ago. It has become that complicated for them. So they've got to very much used to somewhat timely information, if not timely intelligence. They become very dependent on ISR, which is a good thing and it's a bad thing all at the same time. One of the things I don't think we've learned well, and I know that we'll talk about this a little bit, is cyber. What is cyber going to do to us as far as computer network attack and computer network defense? And that's something that we need to continue to work at. Training-wise, I think what's happened, and the General mentioned it, is I think training is getting ahead of doctrine a little bit. And we need to be very, very careful with that. We've been forced to, because the spectrum that we operate across is to make sure that, again, captains, colonels, and brigadiers and lieutenant generals really understand with the tactical and operational level of war. So if you look at the NTC and the Enhanced Mojave Viper on the Marine Corps side, I mean, they all get that and they understand that. But doctrine is lagging a little bit behind. So that's something that we all need to work at, I think, somewhat. And then logistics. I think logistics, the thing that we need to work on is logistics is an Achilles heel, if you will, in Afghanistan, because a lot of it is done through convoy operations. You all understand what that brings as far as risk. So we need to look very hard at unmanned aerial vehicles when it comes to cargo and resupply and issues like that. And that will make a big difference. So I really am looking forward to your questions. And again, thanks for having us here today.
Okay. Good morning. I just want to make sure that you know that Bob said that 3 of the folks up here are Leavenworth graduates. I happen to be one of them. And I still remember the days of 2 up, 1 back, never send tanks without infantry, so that's my complete education for 1 year at Leavenworth. From the Navy side, I think what the Navy's going to look at and what the nation's going to look from the Navy to look at over the next couple of years is we're going to start going through, I think, a reorganization of what we look at overseas. In today's paper, for example, the local paper, you see that 5,000 troops, ground troops coming out of Afghanistan starting this summer. I don't know if that's going to be the right number or not. It may be 10,000. But I think you're going to start seeing a reduction, a big reduction in the forces we have in Afghanistan to go the reduction we've had already in Iraq. And then the ground forces, Army and Marine Corps, are going to start taking a look at themselves. What do we do over the next 5 to 10 years? On the Navy side, I think the next 5 to 10 years are going to look at how do we re-engage around the world? Because the defense military side is not just going to go in a standstill as we rebuild some forces and give some other forces a well-deserved rest. And I think that, quite honestly, I believe the Navy and the Air Force is going to start taking more of a lead as we see it going forward, especially in the next 4 years. That question then is, what do we do? And where do we go? And how do we balance the Navy? The Navy of today is not the Navy of 10 years ago. It's not the Navy certainly of 40 years ago. It's much smaller. You just can't put the number of ships together and send them where you want to go. So you got to pick and choose. The distances are still great. And is it right to balance the fleet 50-50 Atlantic and Pacific, or is it make more sense to maybe go 60-40 with the favoring toward the Pacific? And the forces that go with it. And then go through the political knuckle dragging of do you remove forces, do you remove a carrier from Norfolk and send it to San Diego or out to Guam or wherever you can send it? Does it make sense to do that from the standpoint of being able to get to the full spectrum in a timely manner. I also believe that, again, especially as the Marines start coming back in, how do we redo our expeditionary forces? I personally believe, and I can say this now wearing no uniform, I think that has sort of lapsed in the last 10 years because of what we've had to do. Do we have to go back to that, and how do we get back to that with some of the problems we have? And we have some problems of getting the ships ready, of getting back in that form and that shape. On the cyber side, I'm an old timer. I still have to read the book and figure out how to get through the internet and whatnot. But I always worry about who's out there that's going to take some of those magical moments away from us. There's some smart enemies out there, and if they're going to look up and they're going to say, you know, if we get that satellite and that satellite and this satellite, or maybe just 2 of the 3, we've taken the GPS system down. And I recall in my younger days, trying to get from Hawaii to Midway. We found Midway. Our sister ship did not. And there was no satellites then, it was just doing by sextant. Well, what if you lose some of the capability you have now that you've gotten very warm and fuzzy about, that all of a sudden just doesn't exist, and what do you fall back on? I think in that case, believe it or not, some of the more mature, that's my sort of polite term for old timers, would be able to fall back on. I don't know if the younger generation can do that because they've gotten so used to just making those fingers go through the computers to find out where to go and how to get the perfect communications. So that's my look at what challenges face us ahead in terms of full spectrum ops and where we head.
Okay, thank you. Bill?
Well, the events of the past week have caused many of us in the room to reflect on kind of where we were in 9/11. Where the Air Force was in 9/11, from the combat Air Force's perspective, we were primarily shaped to be able to participate in major combat ops. A couple of years after 9/11, when we went into Iraq, I had a front row seat for that part of the air components part of the joint fight when we did the major combat ops of invading Iraq, and with a, some would say, smaller than what we'd like ground force. And how did the Air Force and the ground forces and the Marines and the special ops all work together to do that major combat ops? We did that fairly well, and then for the last 8 years we've been dealing, as you all know, with an irregular warfare, counterinsurgency fight, a very decentralized fight, a different kind of fight for an air component to have to support. And we have done that, I think, fairly well, but we've had some lessons that we've learned and some successes that will carry forward to full spectrum operations. If you just look at the technical, tactical side of some of the things we've developed to help the ground forces in the last 8 years, we've got smaller weapons. All our weapons are precise. We can drop cargo in a valley or on a mountaintop with precision that we never used to be able to do before. The ISR that's in demand, some would say an insatiable demand for ISR, but we have complete air superiority, and we have the technical ability to provide intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance down to the platoon level through data-linked full motion video feeds, and we've been doing that with an expanding capacity in the desert. The one thing that we were not ready for after the Saddam statue fell and we settled into this fight that we've been in, this very difficult fight, the seam between the air component and the ground component, what we call our TACS, our Theater Air Control System. It's where the airmen are with the grunts, with the soldiers on the ground in their talk, and how do we explain to the ground commander what air can do for this joint fight. That system that we had when we invaded Iraq was primarily designed for kinetic operations, for bombs and bullets and close air support. That's what that system was designed for. And when we got into the counterinsurgency, irregular warfare, decentralized fight that the general was mentioning about, getting support down to that very lowest level, how well did that system work, the integration and synchronization of air and ground? And quite frankly, particularly after looking at how the Marines did their system, we decided we needed to do some changing in the Air Force, and that's what we've been working on the last few years. Because air-powered brings to today's fight, not only an irregular warfare fight, but also higher-end MCO fights. Air power brings more than just bombs and bullets. And so we looked at what expertise we had down at the division, brigade, and lower levels. And we've been augmenting that over the last several years with mobility expertise, with ISR expertise, with electronic warfare, and with space expertise. Pushing those experts that are in that part of our domain, pushing them out of our Air Operations Center and out into the level where it matters in that decentralized fashion that was described before. A significant change to our theater air control system. We've almost doubled the number of JTACs that we have, Joint Terminal Attack Controllers, our enlisted airmen that are down at the lower levels, working with the soldiers on the ground and either calling in fires or maybe coordinating tomorrow's ISR activity. Our air liaison officers, airmen officers that are down with the ground units, we have significantly increased the production of air liaison officers, and we've added a whole new breed of air liaison officers that do not come from a rated community, but come from a special ALO community. We have changed our organizational structure. We've pushed some in more of a decentralized fashion from decisions that used to be made a couple years ago only exclusively in the CAOC down at the lower levels in Iraq and Afghanistan, and empowered the air commanders that are in those countries while still retaining a theater air component commander construct. We hadn't done that a few years ago, and that caused a lot of challenges in executing our joint fighting. We mentioned Leavenworth. I had one of my best assignments of my life, but Leavenworth led 4 years ago a thing called JAGIC, a Joint Air-to-Ground Integration Cell. Quite simply taking an Army's TOC and an Air Force's ASOC, Air Support Operations Center, and putting soldiers and airmen sitting side by side with a common picture of the battlefield, common understanding of commander's intent, and being able to execute and not just deconflict rotary wing, fixed wing, surface fires, and unmanned vehicles, not just deconflict them, but truly integrate and synchronize those activities. You could only do that when you have soldiers and airmen sitting next to each other looking at a common operating picture. And you're probably wondering why we haven't done that to this point. But this, not only this fight, but also innovations that have done at Leavenworth, at their earth, wind, and fire experiments, also agile fire experiments, have led the Army and the Air Force to look at a new way in the future of doing command and control at lower levels. And we're moving out in that fashion. The General mentioned earlier about developing commanders with agility to handle different situations. One of the things that we have been challenged us in the Air Force is we tended to be, particularly in major combat ops, very focused on centralized control and decentralized execution, almost to the point where some of us airmen don't really understand what that means. And just because you can centrally control something doesn't mean you necessarily should do it. As a matter of fact, this fight has highlighted that point. And so how do we decentrally do air operations but still keep the advantage of having the great effects of theater air power that can go from one end of the theater to another? How do you still keep that theater perspective but also be able to decentrally execute air and give authorities down to the lower levels to be able to help that company commander, brigade commander, and down to lower levels? And we have had to change our construct, our air component commander construct. We've changed that in the last 2 years with the current commander over in theater now, General Hostage. We've changed that and given more power down at the air commanders in Iraq and Afghanistan who are in daily 365 contact with those Joint Task Force commanders on the ground. And that's a different approach to how we run the Air Component Command philosophy that is now coming out in joint doctrines, coming out in Air Force doctrine, and we're exercising that as we speak. And it has applicability to things other than just irregular warfare. It has applicability to disaster response like we found in Haiti, across the whole range of military operations. Lastly, when I looked at that Army Pub 3.0 and I looked at the definition of full spectrum operations, instead of just the offensive and defensive, it also talks about the level of threat that you're going against. A traditional threat, irregular warfare threat that we mentioned, a catastrophic threat, an enemy that has nuclear, biological, or chemical munitions, but also a disruptive threat. Our traditional threat that we prepare for a fight of tomorrow, the traditional, in my case, the missiles or the airplanes that we would go against to get air superiority, that traditional threat has significantly changed in the last few years. Picked up the paper yesterday and read about a new fighter that China has developed and is pushing out. And the understanding that air superiority will be a given is not true across the range of military operations. And so the nature of that threat that we face from an Air Force, we face as an air component, has significantly changed. We are better at irregular warfare, granted. We work better with the Army in IW and counterinsurgency. But when we look at threats that a near-peer competitor may face in major combat operations, the thing that I worry about are those disruptive threats. Cyber, electronic warfare, things that mess with our young enlisted and officers that have grown up with always knowing where GPS, always knowing where they are because of GPS, of relying on communications, relying on a network, or relying on a data link. When we have an enemy that messes with that takes that away from us, how will our young airmen fight the fight and continue to fight through that fog and friction that will most certainly be there? We just finished an exercise a few months ago out at Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas, where we injected a significant amount of that type of disruptive activity into our air operations. And there was a heck of a lot of learning that took place out there in Las Vegas. And it highlighted the fact that we have been fighting a fight for the last 10 years, supporting a joint fight where a lot of that has been a given. The communications, the links, the radars, all the things that we rely on to fight an air fight has been there. And when you fight an adversary where that is taken away from you or disrupted, how do we react and fight to that? And that's how our training has changed, our focus of training has changed in the last 2 years to be able to handle that part of the spectrum of operations. That's what the Air Force thinks about when we look about full spectrum operations across a range of military operations, across a variety of threats for today and tomorrow. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you to the panel for their initial remarks. I know that generates questions in your mind. It generated a question in mine as I look across the audience, and I see such a diverse collection, I know, of industry, of coalition, allied, and joint players here. We heard the service perspectives, no doubt, from their Navy, Army, Air Force, and Marine. What I would like to do is, as a first question to the panel, and I warned them a little bit about this, but I'm going to add a slight twist to it. It's 2014 now. It's 2014. We're not in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I'll just be politically correct and point out that that is a progression we're in front of us. We will likely not have that kind of as a crucible of training, if you will, as a way to be changing the joint and coalition force. We will have other challenges, no doubt. But go to 2014 and look back, if you will, that hilltop and looking back. And what success would you most worry about that we may forget in that period of time? What should we make sure we don't forget of the successes we've gotten to date? Because I think I heard a fairly optimistic and positive picture of where we're at today. So go to 2014, look back, and worry a little bit about what success we need to ensure we continue to leverage and exploit, particularly as it relates to joint and coalition action. And since you're still warm down there, Bill, I'll start on your end, all right? You're all lathered up.
I was hoping to be last here. This is how I was going to flow. My answer is quite simple. I mean, I did go to Leavenworth back in the 90s, and I learned more in that year as the one airman in a small group of really smart Army guys, having to not just defend air power, but to figure out how does air power fit into this joint fight. But now you look at what we've been through as a service, what we've been through supporting a ground fight. We've done some things incredibly well. We have been able to respond when troops get in trouble on the ground and they'd make that 911 call for help, whether it be in Iraq or Afghanistan, both fairly big countries, with a few airplanes and in the right position. We've been able to respond to get overhead within minutes, even going 500, 600 miles an hour within minutes. We've been able to do that from a command and control perspective, better than probably in most previous conflicts. Where we have progressed and learned is this integration and synchronization of air and ground. It's the airman understanding what the ground commander needs and the ground commander understanding what air can give to provide the joint success to his problem for today and tomorrow. And that took a cultural change within our service. It took an organizational change within that theater of control system that I described before. And that has been a success story of this conflict, this protracted irregular warfare counterinsurgency conflict. It is significantly better today than it was 8 years ago. And I would be very upset if 3 years from now if we go backwards on that cooperation and understanding, when we're faced with a different challenge that will require a joint solution, require the services to communicate together, the components to fight together, if we step away from some of these lessons learned, these advances we've made in air-to-ground cooperation, I would be very upset at that, sir.
Good. Al, what about you?
My feeling is, if you look at 2014 and then you go back to today and you say, well, what do I have to do between now and 2014 to be strong in 2014? My belief is that we're going to be starting to feel, we haven't seen it yet, but I think we're going to start to feel a real penny pinch. And the penny pinch is going to say, where do you take the funds on where do our forces, military forces, look like in 2014, and how prepared are they? And my belief is you take care of what you have today so that they can survive the years to get to 2014, which means maintenance money, training money, and taking care of the force, the people, the men and women who come into our force. How do you take care of them as they go forward, that you don't lose sight of them, or don't lose sight of the maintenance of the ships, and that's what I'm focusing on, really the ships, that you don't take the money out of the ships, reduce their maintenance funds, and give it to, well, I'm going to put it in R&D and some new things going forward after 2014. I think the world is going to come, just going to go faster and faster time-wise. So you can't just say, I'm going to take away the money today from all the current stuff and put it to the future. You got to take care of what you have today so that by 2014, which is not that far away, it's 3 years out, that by 2014, I still have a strong force that can do the things it does. There's going to be some resting. There's got to be some resting, especially, I think, personal opinion, on the part of the ground forces. They've got to get some rest, redo, get whole, get going again. And I think as they get that rest, the other forces, in this case, I think Navy and Air Force, are going to have to take the lead to be ready by 2014. And I think there are good programs en route to get there. My concern always, and I go back to the early 70s, I remember I was a young lieutenant then, had all my hair, and I was listening to Zumwalt in 1971, this is 40 years ago, talking about what the hell do we do now that we can really see Vietnam winding down and everybody's coming after us to change our ways. What do we do now to prepare for the future? And remember, there was still a Cold War big time going on then. And they made the decision then of reducing the fleet considerably. We talk about a 290-ship Navy today. When I first got commissioned from the Naval Academy and went to my first ship, there was over 750 ships in the United States Navy. So it's a different world. We can't do that today. But we can't just say, okay, we're going to everybody takes a rest. It just won't work that way. So I think we've got to take care of what we have today. Maybe go slow on what we have for the future. We've got some fantastic systems out there. I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel. Just take care of what we have today, maintenance and training, and make sure we take care of the people.
Denny, what do you think? 2014.
2014, first of all, if you haven't figured it out, I did not go to Leavenworth. Went to the College of Naval Warfare in Newport and turned out okay. 4 things, 2014, 4 things, and the Admiral mentioned one of them, but first thing I think is education. You cannot go back to the old way we educated our officer staff NCOs and NCOs. If you do that, we're going to repeat Vietnam all over again. And I was around during that time frame. You can't do that. The education process today, regardless of what service school you go to, whether it's, the basic school or the College of Naval Warfare or Carlisle, it's interactive and they're challenging. They're challenging. You've got to let your officers and staff NCOs and NCOs challenge the institution. Because if you don't do that, I think we're going to have an issue later on. Second thing is, we're always going to fight coalition and joint. I think that's a given. I think we all understand that now. We fought going against joint for a long time, since Goldwater-Nichols, and I think we've gotten way past that. And I think we've gotten very comfortable now fighting joint and coalition. The third thing is the interagency. You've got to be able to fight and cooperate and integrate and coordinate and synchronize with the interagency. If you're a young captain out there and if you can't work with the USAID, you've got an issue. And you can't work with whoever it happens to be out there, Treasury, Justice, CIA, whomever. And then the last thing I would say, and the Admiral mentioned it, and I couldn't agree more, is you got to be able to sustain the force. I think, you know, we have learned over the last 5 years, you know, we have got to pay attention to the force. Dwell, you know, if you're part of the land army, like both the Marine Corps and the Army are right now, you know, dwells at 1-to-1, sometimes less depending on your skill set. And we've got to get it back up to 1-to-2. You've got to be able to rest the force. PTSD is out there, TBI is out there, and of course all the horrific injuries and amputations and so on and so forth that you see out there. If we don't pay attention to those 4 things, and if we're looking back at 2014, then I think we've got a real issue with, you know, a shallow military, if you will.
Thank you very much. Bob?
Yeah, thanks, sir. You know, there's so much to think about and recall, and that you want to preserve from what we've learned over the last 10 years and ensure that we have it in the force for 2014. And education and things that were mentioned by the panel are chief among them. But the first thing that came to mind was the importance of the work that we have done with our coalitions and with our other government agencies to build indigenous security forces and institution capacity, building partner capacity. You know, Secretary Gates' West Point speech a couple months ago kind of rattled the cage a little bit, especially when he said that any Secretary of Defense that advises the Commander-in-Chief to put major armor formations in the middle of the Middle East or in Central Asia ought to have his head examined. So all the armor officers in the Army were just looking what branch they ought to transfer to. He subsequently came back and clarified that really what he's challenging us in the military to do is think about how we fight wars differently. And in other words, how do you go to war against an enemy that resides within a country that you're not at war with? How do you go to war against the Taliban that's operating in northern Pakistan when you're not at war with Pakistan? Or how do you go to war against Al-Qaeda of Arabia that's operating in Yemen when you're not at war with Yemen? And so he's challenging us to think about these things. But one thing we've learned over the last 10 years is that we have partnered with indigenous forces to build their capacity, not only the security forces, but we partnered with other government organizations, as Denny was saying, to build their institutional capacity as well. And we've got to get good at that. We have to think through what our doctrine needs to be, how we're going to organize ourselves for this fight, because I think this is one of the key things that we're going to be fighting in the future.
Terrific. Thank you. Well, listen, we've got microphones scattered out here in front. An opportunity for you to ask questions. As you can see, very diverse viewpoints and very professional panel here. Please take the opportunity. If you would, state your name and if you'd like, your affiliation or organization, and pose the question to a member of the panel or in general to the whole panel, and then I'll play maestro up here. We've got 30 minutes, so we've got some time. So please, your questions. Thank you.
Sir, Bill Newland from Sonalist. My question's for General Caslen, and I support you identified 2 critical competencies. I think critical thinking and being adaptive. Our joint warfighters have had some tremendous experience. You can learn by training, education, and/or experience. And the last 9-10 years of experience for our young mid-grade leaders has given them the opportunity to really hone their skills. As you go to 2014, just to follow up on the questions you had here, we lose that experience in the environment. How is the Army from Leavenworth, TRADOC going to keep honing those skills, giving the either immersive training or whatever techniques you're looking at to hone those skills where we don't have the actual on-the-ground, boots-on-the-ground experience in those countries?
Okay.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. That really goes to the heart of our leader development strategy for the Army, and really applicable to all of our military forces. Is how do you develop these adaptive and these agile leaders that can think through some of these complex situations that immediately have strategic impacts based on their operational and tactical what they've done. And leader development is not only a function of experience, but it's also a function of the training. So we have to make sure our training is right, and it's also a function of our education, as Denny was saying. So it's very important as we look to the future that we make sure that we get our professional education correct, that it's got the outcomes that we want to define, and that we integrate the instruction through all of our curriculums for all of our cohorts, whether it's warrant officers, non-commissioned officers, and our officers, and even our civilians. And then we got to make sure that we have the training correct so that we understand what the outcomes of the training are and what the training responsibilities are, not only for the institution, but for the MOS producing training that takes place, and also the unit training that has to occur in order to maintain the readiness. And one of the things I think we've been deficient on, because we've had such one-to-one dwells, you know, we haven't had a lot of that unit training, because we quickly put the teams together and do, the institution Army's been training them and getting them back into the fight. So we've got to make sure all of that's correct as we look at our leader development strategy. The other thing that we are also looking at is, in order to have a senior leader that can operate strategically and navigate with all the different minefields that are in the coalitions that they're going to be involved in, and also within the beltway of Washington, D.C., is we've got to make sure our leader development for our senior leaders is correct. So we're taking a look at our leader development for officers and what that officer career timeline looks like, and we're actually looking into broadening assignments and putting officers into some of these broadening assignments that help gear them towards success when they become senior officers and operate in some of those different environments.
Thank you, sir.
Very good. Tap that microphone if you would. Is that mic on? Just tap it. Good. Thank you.
Yeah, it's light, but
All right, good. All right, I'll tell you, we've got, you took a knee back there. I better get you to the mic quickly there. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, hi. My name's Jeffrey Damon Capella. I'm a United States Army veteran, Ground Zero veteran, graduate and alumni of Syracuse University, and I would like to first thank the panel for extending us the courtesy of their time. That said, I was wondering what the panel's strategies, what strategies does the panel foresee being conducive to reduce or relieving the challenges posed by mission creep and resource scarcity, mission creep doing the broadening of the threats and technical diffusion from the United States post-industrial core to the, to the periphery, human security and traditional security nexuses, and resource scarcity, there we go, thank you. Resource scarcity caused by the rise of non-military public consumption, and as well as how do you get around, or could you go into detail a little bit further, getting around institutional resistance towards maximizing coordination between services and crossover between high and low intensity conflict?
That sounds like a thesis.
Right, sorry. Wait, I had a whole panel.
All right, you've got 4 people on the panel. Okay, so, Bill?
No, you had me this time, man.
You look like you locked that in.
If you're going to make me do that, you got to synthesize that question, okay?
All right, well, I guess I could sum it up this way. You have resource scarcity caused by the rise of non-military public consumption, which is making everybody kind of tighten their belt. Maybe there's some things that you guys could use to different agencies that don't even have a military mission role in the idea that it offsets the rise of their costs and gives us more resources to do what we need to do both in high and low intensity conflict. Are there any ideas regarding that?
I know that Bob talked about fighting wars differently and perhaps the fiscal constraints and the choices we face. Maybe there's something there that you might think about.
Well, I thought there was an advantage to being on the end. So, I'll tell you, the fiscal constraints that we're in right now, I'm leaving this afternoon to go up to D.C. to go to an air staff meeting to talk just about, our portion as we look to the budget for FY13 and beyond, right, of the constraints that are on just the Air Force's part of the DoD budget, which all the services that are represented here are being influenced the same way to a large extent. So my service is not as big as the Army, but I think proportionally we're all feeling that squeeze. The call for the Secretary of Defense for efficiencies, assumes that we have some level of inefficiencies in our current structure, that we are rapidly looking at our organizational construct and where we have our forces. For us, for my service, you mentioned mission creep. My chief of staff is pretty clear about what our mission is in supporting the joint force. So we have changed, as I mentioned before, on the irregular warfare. Okay, you're shaking your head, so I'm not going for where you're going for. So let's.
I'm saying that non-military public consumption, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, they could learn a lot of things from the things you learned regarding organizational efficiency, which would alleviate the resource scarcity caused by the rise of non-military public consumption. Have you ever thought about, well, for example, think of ARPANET. ARPANET was the beginning of Internet. Internet sat there and has all these positive spillovers to other areas that have nothing to do with defense. I'm saying maybe you guys, is there any thoughts by the people on the panel of leveraging current efforts of the military to sit there and help non-military public consumption to become less, like to minimize the rise of their costs, so we have more money to do the things that we need to do here?
So military working with the non-military sector and right, encouraging them to be more efficient.
Right. teaching
translating
them the
ideas.
lessons you learned.
Ideas in their direction.
Let me chime in. I'm the only guy not wearing a uniform here. I think, as a nation, we got to reduce spending for certain selected areas. I'm not sure that that money that we save necessarily is going to go to the military, but we're watching a debate right now go on with Medicare. I'm a Medicare guy. I'm on Medicare. I mean, I'm over 65, so that's where I am. Are there inefficiencies in that system? You're absolutely right. I don't know what anybody in uniform can do about that. I would say out there, looking at those wearing a civilian uniform, you vote in November, continue to vote, and continue to raise the flag and say, what the hell are you doing with my money? It's my money that I'm giving you. Now, in my case, I've got a wife that says, we're going to stay on this diet, we're going to get our weight down, and the blood pressure is going to be down, our cholesterol is going to be down, and we're not going to have to worry about seeing doctors. You know, that's part of it. I think the other part, though, in terms of resources, is that we're going through the throes of the time, and I'll tell you, this is not any different. It's almost like a cycle completed in the early 70s. We were going through the same thing, and back then, what the military had to look at was this, you know, the Soviet Union. So they still have to look at what threats are out there on the low end and the high end. Now, low and high end, I'll sort of phrase this more or less from what I think a naval perspective. We have, the Navy has, high-end ships, and they should have low-end ships. I say should, because I think we got away from that. We got enamored with the high end, which we needed. You need the aircraft carriers. You need the high capability submarines. You need the capable Aegis cruisers and destroyers. But you also need some at the low end that can go to countries that perhaps Aegis or carriers are overkill for. So you need something like, quite honestly, an LCS. But look how long it's taken us to get there. And how many mistakes did we make getting there? I think what happens too is sometimes we want the perfect solution. We want it to be 100% right. And yet in the deliberations that occur in the five-sided building or other buildings, you know, 90–95% may not be all that bad. And then as you get in there, you sort of improve the process as it goes. So I think that's a big inefficiency. The other inefficiency, quite honestly, and it plays out every day, is in our Congress. I mean, the guys in the military or the defense can't do that. Again, I think, and quite honestly, recipients and voters out there will vote in folks that support them. In the state of Virginia, you know, I look at Webb and Warner and say, what have they done for the state of Virginia? What have they done for me in Norfolk? And sometimes the answer is they're doing okay, and sometimes haven't figured that out yet. Okay. So I think in the resource area and in the low-high area, the resource area, I think this country is going through the throes of how do we reduce spending, where do we take what we have, and who do we give it to for the sake of our future. And then November 2012, hopefully all of us will go to the voting booth and decide what we believe in and vote accordingly.
I think we've got, did you have a question, Marie?
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, gentlemen. My name is Sergeant Nick Pruner. I'm here as a student from North Georgia, Caslen State University. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to address the panel. My question is in the past 10 years, we've seen a lot of roadblocks and into the implementation of these governments in the Middle East and Afghanistan and Iraq. With this past wave of democracy that we've seen in Northern Africa, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, what role will the DoD play in the creation of these new democracies, their stabilization, as you said, General, and more importantly, the legitimization of them so we don't have future problems down the road, such as we're seeing now? Thank you.
You look like you're anxious, Danny. Go.
Well, hey, thanks, Sergeant. You're obviously a pretty smart young guy, right?
Yes, sir.
Where do you go to school?
North Georgia, Caslen State University.
Okay. To me, that's almost a political question. I don't think, as far as DOD and governments, we don't get involved in that. Obviously, if you look at Libya right now and other areas of the Middle East, that's NATO, and that's the way it really should be, and that's the way we're going to react, I think, as a country. And as far as stability, I think we can do the best stability-wise across the services when we work at what we call either theater security cooperation or phase 0. That's, in other words, mill-to-mill contacts, training them to have their own internal security, things like that. We do that extremely well, even now, with the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, and the Army. And we're still doing that globally. We have 100,000 troops, if you will, in Afghanistan. There's another 100,000 deployed around the globe doing those kind of things. So that's the best way that we can impact on governments.
Thank you, sir.
Bob, did you have any answer? Okay. I know. Sir, please.
Gentlemen, thank you for entertaining questions from the floor.
Step just a little closer, please.
Thank you for entertaining questions from the floor. That is, for answering them. I don't know that any of them has been entertaining for you. I have one for General Caslen and one for General Rue. They both focus on factors associated with increasing collaboration and knowledge sharing. General Rue, you said that that there were cultural changes that facilitated the increased collaboration between ground and air folks. And what I wanted you to tell me, if you could, is what specific factors did you notice that facilitated that change, that cultural change, especially leader behavior? And then General Caslen, want to hear about how it was that learning was put so immediately from the field into operating units. How do those lessons learned move so quickly? What were the factors involved in that knowledge sharing enterprise, especially warfighter forums, if you can think about how that looked from your point of view? So either one of you gentlemen, please hold forth.
Well, I can give you a short one, sir. Go ahead. Okay. On the, for the collaboration and the leadership aspect of it that you talked about. I was in our Air Operations Center when we invaded Iraq. I was one of our CAOC directors. I worked for General Mosley, who was the Air Component Commander, who had a very close relationship with General McKiernan, who was the Land Component Commander, who had a close relationship, all of them with Admiral Keating, the Naval Component Commander. And these three component commanders all worked for General Franks as we did major combat operations. And the cooperation between the components was magnificent, quite frankly, because everyone knew that that band of brothers knew and trusted each other in that relationship. Yeah. And we had an objective to accomplish, and we accomplished it in a very top-down, directed strategy to task, and executed that war plan, that part of the war plan, very well. When the ground forces had to control and stabilize the situation, and before the counterinsurgency operations started coming up in full, we were protecting, pipelines and other roads and other lines of communication. As that settled into a different kind of a fight, a more decentralized fight, part of the friction that developed was between the air component that had done this centralized thing so well and executed 2,000 sorties a day in support of the joint fight, now had to support a very decentralized fight, the fight that the general was describing, down at the company and platoon level. And how does that air power, whether it be ISR or a bomb or a bullet, how does that get down there? And our organizational construct of having one air commander, if you will, for a whole theater, Iraq, Afghanistan, Horn of Africa, and the countries in between, and theater security cooperation of those countries, having one three-star general air component commander in charge of that whole thing. That was our construct. How well did that blend with the fights that were going on the ground in Iraq? You're shaking your head, and I'll shake it with you. It did not.
Didn't blend.
And
sure.
it did not. And we were slow to recognize that as a service, and we have changed that. But that was a cultural difference. A cultural between how we were trying to portray air power, and our goal was to integrate and synchronize air, and everything that the ground was trying to do. It was difficult for the ground to understand that when we weren't there.
But if I heard you correctly, it was the relationship between senior leaders and their ability to trust one another and share a common vision for some kind of outcome that facilitated that. Is that correct?
you didn't say anything about academic freedom here.
It is on the record. I don't know what to tell you.
I think for anyone that was there during those years that you're describing, I think that there'd be many that would agree with your assessment.
Well,
and I think that was recognized, and my service and my component have changed in the last 2 years because of that cultural friction, and to me it's a understanding. I mean, I mentioned Leavenworth not just because I was sucking up to the speaker, but because I had to explain air power to really smart Army guys every day as the one lone airman in this small little fellowship, and not only that, I had to understand where they were coming from, and I only got that because I sat next to them every day. I was there, and when you rely on virtual presence, and when that perception is actual absence. You know, I'm there about 2,000 miles away, and I'll talk to you on a phone or a BTC. That doesn't always work. And I'm a technology-based service, and so we like that kind of stuff. But sometimes it's all about the relationships. It's all about that trust and relationship between the commanders, and you only get that, in my case, when you have an air commander that's forward, that has the trust and the personal relationship with that Joint Task Force commander that say, what do you need from the air component? I'll get it for you right now. What aren't we getting for you? And our organizational construct for a good number of years did not engender that feeling, in my opinion.
Well,
we have made that change at the highest level.
About 15 minutes. Let General Caslen answer the second question you posed.
Thank you.
Yeah, hey, sir, thank you very much for your question. About lessons learned and how we integrate that back into the force.
So quickly.
We have to do that. And because really, what we're finding in the Iraq-Afghanistan battlefield is that it's evolving quickly. And because it's evolving quickly and the operating environment is modifying and changing, we have to make sure that the units that are getting prepared to go back into theater understand the changing of the evolution of the battlefield, and then they understand the lessons that are working, the doctrinal principles, and then how to apply that doctrinal principle in tactics, techniques, and procedures. In the lessons learned, in the Center for Army Lessons Learned, we're trying to transform it so it can do exactly what it's due. Its main purpose is to capture lessons, inform doctrine, and push it out to the training base so that the training centers will capture those lessons and then be able to train forces that go back into theater. And it's got to be done quickly. In order to capture the lessons, the traditional way has always been to have the spotters that are out there integrated within the units and would capture lessons, and then they would write pamphlets, and then the pamphlets would be distributed based on requests, pushing them down. What we're trying to do in transforming that now is to be able to establish the lessons learned database and integrate that electronically, virtually, with all the other organizations that have databases, lessons learned databases that are out there, not only within the Army, but within the other services, and even with some other organizations, so that you have a network of integrated databases. So any service member, regardless of rank, can go online and say, I need some information on Kurd-Arab relations. And it doesn't matter where it comes from. It does its search like a Google search, and boom, all of a sudden, there's a whole display of information that they have to do. We're also finding that with this generation and with the technology of cloud computing, that this generation can educate and dialogue among themselves. So what we try to do is set up lessons learned forums so that soldiers or service members, regardless of what that forum is, that they can have a discussion among themselves. And we call that Rapid Adaptation Initiative. And that's a tremendously powerful initiative.
You think the warfighter forums currently involved and are emerging are serving that need and achieving that goal, sir?
Well, the warfighting forums is also, connected with technology online so that commanders across the entire force can sit down and have discussions about their warfighting function and their organizations and some of the tactics that they're using in theater and the ones that they're going to have to be using, and which is also another way to do that. Utilizing technology to be able to transfer the flow of information and lessons learned. But the overall purpose is capture the lesson, inform doctrine, push it out to the training centers so our units can train so that they can be prepared for what they're going to do in theater next.
So while that's going on,
Thank you, sir. Got 8 minutes and two more questioners, and I'd like to welcome General Odierno, please. Thank you for coming to the forum today, and we'll finish with these two questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you, sir. My name is Frank Richardson. I'm a retired Air Force colonel. Came into the Air Force in 1974, and one of the challenges back then was draw down the forces. We talked about the 2014 scenario where we're going to bring troops home, the big lessons learned. I think training and education is a big part of what we need to do going forward. I think also the big challenge, and that's what I need input from the panel, is cultures, language skills. I think that's the biggest challenge for us as Americans and U.S. forces, is the fact that we don't teach languages and politics and history and things like that in our schools anymore. And I think part of the leadership in the military and the operations overseas needs to bring that back to our educational system. How do you folks feel you can influence U.S. actions going forward as a nation to bring the best of America from values and an institution standpoint to future operations?
I know General Caslen runs a very large school complex and does a lot of training and education and thinking on that, so let me ask you to offer an answer.
Okay, I'll be brief in the interest of time. First of all, we recognize the tremendous importance of not only the culture, but how it's integrated with the foreign language. I mean, if there's one lesson that we learned that's paramount about building teams is the relationships we have to have within these teams. And you can't have a relationship unless you understand the culture, the drivers of instability, the natural hierarchy of order, and all those sorts of things. And you just really got to understand it. That has forced us to look at culture and foreign language from a strategic standpoint in 3 lines of effort. The first line of effort is that, for our officers anyway, is before their commissioning, is an emphasis on foreign language, not only like at West Point, but also in our OTC as well. So the development of foreign language, so that you start acquiring a base of understanding why languages are important and the sensitivity to the culture affiliated with it. The second line of effort really is a lifelong learning through professional education. So all of our education curriculums for all the cohorts are looking at culture and foreign language and how you integrate that into the education piece. And the third piece is really specifically targeted for units that are for pre-deployment training. And a good example of that is the AFPAC HANDS program. And so, and there's some organizations that we have within the Training and Doctrine Command that we'll push out to the units that are getting ready to deploy, so that we can get some of their soldiers up to speed on a foreign language, but also not on the foreign language, get the organization up to speed on the culture. So that's kind of how we're addressing it, but we recognize the importance of it.
I know the Marine Corps has some interesting work going on in that area. I would just offer a quick response.
It's, the lines of operation are pretty much the same. If you're a battalion commander now and you're going forward into combat, your requirement is base of close to 300 hours of language and culture before you go forward. And that's tested at what we call our Enhanced Mojave Viper out at 29 Palms. And like the General said, we're stressing that with our young officers, especially the ones that are still in college through the Platoon Leaders Program, ROTC, so on and so forth. We're stressing that. And then to sustain that, we test yearly because I think you have to. And obviously, there's money involved in something like that. But if you can't sustain that language and culture, by the way, I think culture is actually the bigger piece of that, because you have to understand, the culture of the area that you're operating in. If you don't, you can have the best language skills or the best interpreters. It's not going to work for you. So we're working both culture and language, especially at the junior officer and then battalion commander level.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your service.
All right. Thank you. And our last questioner, please.
Yes, sir. George Nicholson from Strat Corp. The question, I guess, we'll start with General Rue. About a year and a half ago, General Norty Swartz, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and Admiral Ruffhead started their initiative for the Air-Sea ConOps, indicating that there'd be a significant outputs from that influencing what the force structure of the future is going to be. For General Caslen, along the same thing, the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army talked about lessons learned out of the portfolio review, how that's going to impact the future. Both these initiatives, what's happening, they indicated there would be unclassified outputs coming out of it, but also how's this going to input the upcoming roles and missions review. Thank you.
I'll be quick. I've spent a lot of time talking about Air Force and Army and how we progressed in the last 8 years. You mentioned Air-Sea Battle, Air-Sea ConOps, an initiative that started about 2 years ago in the Pentagon between the Air Staff and the Navy. A lot of it is classified, but I can tell you the same philosophy that I've been talking about all day today on how the two services work together with a constrained force, with a constrained set of resources against a full spectrum of threats. The Navy and the Air Force, as was mentioned by the Admiral, we face a different kind of a challenge, and when we look at threats like China or countries that have products like that they distribute, that challenge is significant. And for the Air Forces and the Naval Forces to work together, for us to be able to assist them in sea domain control, for them to be able to assist us in air superiority and work together, it's the only way we can do it. So there's there's weapon systems integration. We're both buying the Joint Strike Fighter, but it's also about our tactics, techniques, and procedures that we're developing against this new threat. In addition to the irregular warfare, but looking at the high end, we have significant growth to do, and we're modeling that cooperation after what we've been doing with the Army.
Thank you. Hal, did you have thoughts on that? Pass? Okay. Anyone else? Well, listen, thank you very much for your questions. When you listen to our panel today, I think you've heard some great professionals describe their own service perspectives and the joint and coalition aspects of it, and thank you for the response and the agility in those responses. I didn't hear a lot about technology solutions. I heard a lot about the human dimension, about education, training, and leadership, and it's really not a great surprise. But importantly as well, those personal relationships. So I want to encourage that at lunch today and get after those personal relationships, allow you to go eat, and thank you all for your attendance, your questions, and frankly for the support of this forum. Thank you very much.